everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Foday Mannah to talk about his novel, The Search for Othella Savage, which is published by Quercus. It was shortlisted for this year's Bloody Scotland debut prize and was the winner of now you're going to have to help me with this name, Foday.
The Mosuchuan.
The Most Sichuan Prize. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first of all, hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Ali. Thank you so much for having me. Brilliant.
It's a pleasure. So, first of all, can you give us a synopsis of the novel, The Search for Othella Savage?
Well, a friend I work with, Ali, described it as an example of diaspora noir, and I think that's a good way to look at it. It's your stereotypical crime novel, but the only difference is that it involves more or less members of the Sierra Leone diaspora who happen to live in Scotland. So the inspiration came from the harrowing case. There was a South African nurse, I think around about 2008, Ali, who was abducted from her house here in Scotland. And she was locked in the boot of a car for quite a while. And it was in the deepest of winter. So I found that to be quite harrowing. So I was never really a crime writer per se.
Mm-hmm.
But it just so happened that the competition that I won was asking for novels in the crime genre. So I used this idea and more or less juxtaposed it with issues to do with, for example, the insidious nature of religion and things like that. And then I just tried to model this situation whereby women from the Sierra Leone community are being abducted in Edinburgh and locked in the boots of their cars. And it just grew from there.
Because I was going to introduce you as a crime writer, and then I just went for writer. Do you think of yourselves now specifically as a crime writer, or there's no need, I suppose, to narrow it down in any way?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because, I mean, since I've won the prize or since I've written the novel, Ali, I must say I am humbled and honored by the camaraderie within the crime writing community. And that, besides some other pieces that I'm working on at the moment, actually have deliberately tended to sway towards that. Crime writing, by that I mean. But besides that, Ali, I'm sure you know it yourself that I think increasingly now I'm seeing more and more writers basically not staying in one particular lane. Literature tends to be more or less genres. You can get a situation where genres tend to merge.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that quite a lot, even for some of the other competitions. So, for example, the Booker Prize, was it The Trees by Percival Everett? A few years ago, I remember it getting lots of acclaim. But when I read it earlier, I thought this is literally just a police procedural. Yeah. But he takes issues from history. And even the likes of Colson Whitehead, I think he's won the Pulitzer a couple of times. He's moved away from writing about more or less big issues to do, for example, with race and abuse. And his last two novels have basically been crime novels. So that was always quite an interesting dynamic whereby writers seem to be not staying necessarily in one lane, but merge and write other things. Besides, like I always say, I don't think anybody has a monopoly on misery. I mean, bad things, it's part of human existence. Human beings have the proclivity to do horrible things. And so it just occurs naturally, I suppose.
It's so true. And when I think of, real literary classics, whether it be Jekyll and Hyde, whether it be Crime and Punishment or whatever, these are crime novels.
Crime novels, absolutely. They are. You're absolutely right. They are crime novels. Yeah, absolutely.
And I wonder if you'd agree with this, that in my time reading, crime fiction, say 20 years ago, perhaps had a bit of a stigma to it. People thought it was one thing, and they could, say, well, it's this thing, and this is what it is. It's police procedural, or that's it. And it's a black and white moody cover and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's completely changed, as you suggest.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, I mean, I think I told the story when you interviewed me at Bloody Scotland about my first, because I studied English language and literature in Sierra Leone. And our lecturers were, because when you think, it might have been, it's the legacy that you speak of, Ali, I think, in terms of when you think about literature more or less spreading to all these different regions, the belief was more or less to be considered to be a writer in the strictest sense, you had to basically write classics. And so I remember the lecturer specifically saying, disparaging more or less crime fiction as more or less they're not novels. And he described them as being examples of crime and sex fiction. He did not see them as novels. And I remember at the time I used to read them quite copiously. I mean, the likes of James Hadley Chase, or even things like Frederick Forsyth, not necessarily crime all the time, but espionage and just the kind of, or the Hardy Boys when I was a bit younger.
Yeah.
Franklin W. Dixon, exactly, or Nancy Drew, which was basically, these were crime novels, but there was always seemed to be this sneering attitude when they tended to look down. But you're absolutely right, Ali. I think that method of thinking has moved on. And I think we tend to, I think, was it Rachel Kushner? I think, was it last year when she got shortlisted for the Booker? And the novel was an example of, I think the celebration was amongst, or the excitement was due to the fact that she seemed to have written this espionage novel, which I found to be quite interesting. So if you happen to be a literary fiction writer and if you stray into crime, you are claimed and you're held up, oh, look at what she's done. But whereas the people who do that for, say, for example, all the time, we tend to look down on them. And I found that to be quite ironic, if you know what I mean, Ali. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was this idea that it was kind of all under the umbrella pulp fiction.
Yes, exactly.
Before that was the name of the film, that was the kind of
that was the genre, exactly. Yes,
exactly. I think actually, I mean, if people can go back and still watch this, but the podcast I did with yourself and the fellow debut writer, shortlisted writers, I mean, that was so diverse in terms of the style of books and the content of the book.
Absolutely, yeah.
It really makes that point, I think.
Hey, definitely. I mean, for David, who's won his phenomenal, right, The Reluctant Spy, that is more or less much more to do with espionage and things like that. This ordinary human being who's casting, and you're absolutely right. Claire's is more or less set in a prison. Or you read basically Richard's. I mean, Richard's is just phenomenal the way it looks at aspects of Scottish history, the First World War, and even Natalie's, which is set in a distillery. So you're absolutely right. All these 5 novels that you can put underneath the banner of crime, but they're distinctly different in terms of their thematic context or the thematic sprawl and things like that.
Yeah. So going back to Othella Savage, why was this the story that you wanted to tell for your debut novel?
Well, I just thought, like I said, I mean, if you think about it, I think the foundation crime that inspired the novel involved women. So that made it a bit easier, even though I'm not a woman myself. But I just thought, yeah, when you think about, I mean, in terms of society, you think about movements like, for example, Me Too. I have a child, for example, who's writing a folio at the moment on the suffragettes. So you just go, and I remember telling her today, and she was saying, I'm going to write an essay on the suffragettes. And I said, it will make sense if you perhaps write it from a modern perspective, because even though this happened a long time ago, when you look at life and society today, these concerns are still very relevant. And I suppose the same thing applies to the novel that I wrote, in the sense that it was women who were being abused, but I decided to also tie it to religion, where we come from. And I think I've made that point to you before, Ali, that it was fascinating moving to Scotland in the 90s, and wherever you go, you get, most people don't believe in religion at all. And I found that was quite disorientating to me for a while, because when you think about Sierra Leone, everybody believes, be it Islam or Christianity. And the point I was trying to make is, if you can harness this power and convince people that you are a proxy to a higher God, that gives you significant amount of power to abuse. And that's exactly what happens in everyday life where I come from, but also in the novel, whereby you have these preachers who say, oh, we're going to use these young girls to be like church ambassadors, and your remit is to raise money for the church, even though the methods of raising money are very, very suspect and very, very basically not very nice. So I tied that more or less to the whole thing of crime, and then went down the rabbit hole of looking also about religion and how it can be taken into dark places.
Yeah, and themes of kind of corruption within those institutions are something we'll talk about that in a moment. But I wanted to, first of all, I'm always interested with the quotes that people use at the beginning of their books.
All right.
And you know, yours is, now let me get it. Can I read it out? Is that okay?
Yes, please do.
It was impossible for devils to live in men. Men do as they please, and the devil has nothing to do with it. That's by Mongo Beti.
Yes.
And is that a writer? I don't. That's not.
Yeah, he's right behind me. I'll just bring him down.
Excellent.
Yeah, with it. That's him there. So that's the Poor Christ of Bomber. It's a fascinating book. We studied it in Sierra Leone. It's written by a French writer, Mongo Beti, and it was actually his Cameroonian ally. It was banned in Cameroon, and what he tried to do was to attack French colonial Christianity, because it involves this preacher who is the Poor Christ of Bomber, who goes through these villages in Africa and is trying to convince the native Africans to convert to Christianity. But the novel basically it's a metaphor. It's like a satire at how corrupt this religion is. And a key part of the novel is that they collect all these young girls from their husbands, Ali, and the thinking is, we are going to prepare these girls for Christian marriage. But by the end of the novel, something bad happens. I won't spoil it because somebody might want to read it. But at the end of the novel, something bad happens to the girls, and of course, the pastor leaves and goes back to France. So that always stayed with me. It's a massive theme in African literature. We always look at religion, To this day, a lot of the religion we practice in Africa is based on Western religion, Christianity, God, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and things like that. So I just thought that what he said way back then was a perfect representation of what happens in. We tend to feel that, or they try and convince us that there are demonic forces or there are bad people out there. But no, we always know that the bad people are amongst us. They're human beings of flesh and blood.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of excuse, well, the devil made me do it, sometimes still gets used today, doesn't it?
Exactly, absolutely.
So let's talk a bit about your central characters, or at least some of them. You've got Hawa Barry, who's your kind of central character. Can you talk a little bit about her and her role in the novel?
Yeah, absolutely. She's here. So again, it was just a typical. It was. I mean, that happens. That tends to happen quite a lot. Whereby studying abroad, if you live in Sierra Leone, is very, very expensive, value. So the only way that normally happens is if you get a scholarship, and one of the most common scholarships is the Commonwealth Scholarship. So that's what she has. So it was a case of making her be Othella's friend. Othella, of course, is a citizen. She was born here, very much like myself. So I used Othella's circumstances as somebody who was born in the UK, even though I was born in London, but I made Othella born in Glasgow. And she goes back to Sierra Leone with her parents, similar to what happened to me. When back then in the 70s, what tended to happen is, I think our parents came here from the diaspora, the Caribbean and Africa, but the thinking was you always had to return home to improve the home country. So of course they came here, they got degrees, they studied. My father was an electrical engineer, and then the whole family goes back home. So that's more or less what I used for Othella. And so Hawa, of course, is not as fortunate in the sense that she wasn't born here, but she comes to study, and of course their friendship continues. So when Othella basically disappears, then she tries to see what can I do to find my friend. So fundamentally, it's a story about friendship and the enduring power of more or less companionship and camaraderie, what she needs to do to try and find a friend. So she is, and of course, she has to try and do that within Scotland, Ali, but also I thought it was important for her to also go back to Sierra Leone in the search for her friend.
She's the kind of detective, if you like, if you're calling
it. Absolutely, absolutely.
And you talk about friendships, and she strikes up a friendship with Annika Hart as well.
Yes.
Who's a fantastic character.
Yeah. Annika Hart is an interesting one because, I mean, many people who read, at times you even read reviews, Ali, and even quite a few people, editors and people, were not quite comfortable with her in the sense they found that to be a bit too much of a stereotype.
Right.
The African American, for example, who has a kind of, I wouldn't use the word fetish, but is mesmerized by African culture, that more or less my ancestors came from there, ergo I want to be very, very close to this culture. But I did not see it that way at all. I just thought it would be quite good to have a character like that. She's charismatic, she's full of life, she's bubbly, she sings, she entertains. And I suppose in a way she was a kind of proxy. Many people have also said that to me, even though it was not intentional, that because she's not very familiar with African culture, with how I explain it to her, it more or less gives the reader an opportunity to understand things a bit more. But I just thought it would be interesting to have these disparate female characters. So one from America, one from Sierra Leone, and then of course one who is from Sierra Leone but was born in Glasgow together. And that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, I mean, she seems to be trying to understand the kind of an African experience through Western.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And for a lot of readers, that'll be the case as well.
Yeah, how to negotiate, how to see these different things. So even though and it's interesting because of course growing up in Africa, Africa as a center has always been quite an interesting concept to look at, especially if you think from different perspectives. She doesn't have I went to see Ta-Nehisi Coates at the festival, and he made that point of being an African American, that even if you've never been to Africa, it's an appellation they place on you, that more or less the expectation is that, it might even be to do with your skin color, ergo if you identify as African American, therefore you automatically have this connection whether you like it or not. And I suppose in a kind of way that's what applies to Annika Hart, that okay, well, if my people many years came from them, then there's nothing wrong with me trying to experience that and trying to gain access to it. Especially as when we were growing up, there was always this tendency at times, I think, to look down on Africa. Even when we were growing up in Africa, it was like, I remember seeing, for example, Michael Jackson at the Thriller video. You find more or less anything from the West to be much more fascinating, much more exciting. So I just thought we could possibly reverse that, where she is from America, but she's a bit more fascinated with African culture.
And if they're the kind of heroes of the piece, Pastor Ranka is the kind of a villain, let's put it that way. Talk about him as a creation, because
again, I always think of my stepmom who discovered, I mean, between, of course, me leaving Sierra Leone in the mid-90s early and coming here, but going back in the mid-noughties, so after about a decade, I'm going back, and she had discovered, she joined one of these churches, and it was fascinating watching her transformation. And she always spoke about her pastor, who was the pastor has a name. And even when she came in 2005 to help me take care of my daughter, who was very young at the time, it was almost as if she'd been brainwashed, Ali. The things she would say, in other words, whatever pastor told her, even though pastor wasn't with her, she was literally on a different continent, but whatever he said was gospel, no pun intended. So, for example, I think I've told the story the other day about him saying that women should not wear trousers because trousers are not Christian dressing, and she would not wear trousers. Or even while she was here, if she was buying gifts, she would not buy gifts for her own kids. It was gifts for, that's a new phone, I'll buy it for the pastor. That's another phone, I'll buy it for the pastor's wife. So, and these men tend to do that. I mean, when you go to Sierra Leone, I remember an example from my childhood when I think I used that passage in the book, actually, when people come to the house and pray, Ali, and they claim to see visions. That actually happened to me. I think I was in S5. So, for example, shut our eyes to pray and open my eyes and say, oh, I saw a vision, Ali. I saw a vision of Ali at an airport. Is going to be traveling abroad. And everybody cheers because in their mind, that's a good thing. That more or less means, oh, you're going to be traveling overseas. And when you're a child, you believe these things. It's only when you realize this, you're just making this up. You haven't seen any vision at all, yeah? So it's significant what this part they have, how, and you can see them on the internet. Some of the ones in Nigeria and South Africa, you have these super churches, Ali, that literally like miles long, and they wear designer clothes and they have like fleets of bodyguards. So phenomenally, extravagantly rich, but also have this massive influence. So Pastor Anka is more or less modeled on this caliber or this sketch of pastors and preachers who can be quite not very nice.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can remember in I'm going to say 80s, but it might have been 90s, and it probably went on for much longer. But the kind of Christian right in America, they were preachers, I think they were then, and they were clearly lots of money. And actually,
oh my God, yes,
that show of wealth was almost part of the situation. The deal they had with their congregation was that the richer I am, the better it is for you.
The better I am, exactly, absolutely, phenomenally rich. Yeah, even program I watched, was it Greenleaf? I think Oprah Winfrey's television network had this program. It's on Netflix called Greenleaf, and that's exactly what it is. It's more or less about battling churches. And you're right, Ali. I mean, they travel in private jets. They're phenomenally wealthy. You look at the families; they have these massive stately houses, but they're people they proclaim to be men of God, but there's nothing humble about their lives at all. And that's more or less set in modern times. So that tends, and I think Anaka makes that point also, the belief, especially amongst, I mean, not just Africans, but also African Americans. America in general, America is a very religious country compared, for example, to the UK. I think they make fun of Anaka, but they make fun of Howard. They say to Howard, well, your American presidents always say, God bless America. Your British politicians never say that. And they're right. We don't have our politicians. You never say, for example, John Sweeney. We don't tend to do that in the UK.
No.
So even that's a quite interesting dynamic in terms of America is a Christian country. And even the whole Charlie Kirk thing, you see that quite a lot. The belief that this is a Christian country. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's perhaps got even stronger in recent times, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Was it important for you to write about the Sierra Leonean experience in the UK? Because I don't think I've read about that before.
Yeah, I thought so. I think a lot of the time, Africa is seen like a kind of monolith. There's almost like we are all seen as the same. But I think we are very, very, very different, very multifaceted. I mean, Nigeria, for example, alone, they speak over 80 different languages. Same as Sierra Leone, we speak over like 15 languages. And culturally, there are similarities, don't get me wrong, Ali, but we're also quite distinct in terms of what we do and of course, Africa, Sierra Leone is a very, very tiny country. You don't tend to read a lot about it. There's some phenomenal writers. Aminat Afona, for example, I think, her mother is Scottish, and she also writes phenomenal on Sierra Leone, and a few others. There's several others who also do quite well. But no, I think you're correct. You don't hear them. So I thought it was quite important to not only mention Sierra Leone, but also to specifically set part of the story in Sierra Leone. I thought that was quite important.
And in terms of doing that, so, part is set in Scotland, mainly Edinburgh, another in Sierra Leone. It invites comparisons for the reader between the two.
Yes.
Is that something you wanted to do as well?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, so when you, it's of course, every story also has to have a context and background. So in writing about Sierra Leone, I try to also seed in real life things that were happening in Sierra Leone. So, for example, I've no spoilers, but there's a gas tank explosion, a truck that explodes. That's based on a real thing that happened literally in Sierra Leone, when there's always tends to be power shortages due to poverty. So people more or less rushed a gas tanker and it exploded and killed over 100 people. So that's in the story. There was also a helicopter crash a few years ago. That's in the story, how people travel. So I just thought it was important for authenticity to, you're not only seeing Howard's journey, but you also get a feel of how things operate in Sierra Leone and how things, the very fact that she has to support her sister's wedding. I mean, Cynthia, who was my other half, had to do that, even though she's from Zimbabwe. I remember her having to do that, where she buy it just because she lives overseas. Ali, the assumption is you have a lot of money, and so her sister was getting married in Zimbabwe, and she had to buy all the bridesmaids' dresses, and she buys the bride's dress, and she buys all the shoes, and she buys everything. So that's more or less when the story opens. That's what Howard has to do. Your sister's getting married, it's on you. You need to buy things. So all these cultural things amidst this crime, I thought was quite important.
And I think it's interesting to see the various characters in the different countries and how that changes, because the pastor has power in Edinburgh, but it's limited compared to what's going on in Sierra Leone. And
Absolutely.
similarly, Hawa has maybe the freedom to question slightly more safely than she does when she eventually goes back home.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And I think they make that point. I think that's one of the reasons why the pastor actually escapes back to Sierra Leone, because he knows he has a bit more. And I think Howard makes that point, or I think is it Tina Kano, the newspaper editor, who makes that point, that he has a bit more leeway to abuse people's rights in Sierra Leone because they're almost untouchable. Also significantly because he also has political connections. I think his brother's a minister, so he can more or less do what he wants to do. Whereas, for example, here, we're not saying the UK, you know better than me, it's by no means perfect, but I think there are a few more safeguards and a few more barriers in terms of allowing people to do whatever they want to do. I mean, even though you look across the world, you wonder now, even those are being eroded slowly, so it's not as sturdy as they used to be. But definitely, I think in not just religion, but also patriarchy, men get away far much more in our societies, and that's just the way it is, which is extremely unfortunate and not right at all, but that tends to happen much more.
That kind of, because there's the corruption is partly because the religion is mixed in with the politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, and we can see in many places that's the case. And when you're writing about such things, were you worried about any feedback? Because people, as you say, who may be religious themselves.
Yeah, slightly. I think attitudes are changing, Ali. I think people are beginning to realize, because even when you're on social media, you tend to see many more people. I've seen a tendency much more frequently now to attack and criticize these pastors, as more or less outing as more or less as liars. Right. And that's quite. But even with our parents, I'm seeing. I think power, the dynamics of power, where I come from, is very, very interesting. There's patriarchy, there's religion, but there's also age. In other words, if somebody's older than you, it's almost as if no matter what they say has to apply. And I think all these forces more or less merge together. But I think increasingly now people are beginning to question, especially some of these churches. I'm blatantly saying these guys are just liars. Mm-hmm. You deceive people. It's about making money, and you just more or less exploit people. So not as much as perhaps maybe a decade ago, but not as much. Now many people just shrug and say, yeah, absolutely, these pastors exist. And I think I put a bit in the book, actually. There was one, I think, in Uganda, and this is a true story, who claimed to be able to remove sin from women's bodies by sucking their breasts. Absolutely. And that was something that actually happened. So, and there was another one I think of when I wrote the book. Somebody sent me a link. I think there was one in Sterling, Ali, who got convicted, I think a Zimbabwean pastor, for similar kind of things, so more like sexual exploitation. So I think there's an awareness about how diabolical these people can be. And I think there's like a sea change whereby people are more or less standing up to them a bit more, saying to them, no, you do not represent God. You're not a good person.
Because the pastor's life and his church's life in Edinburgh, part of that is to kind of take advantage of young women, vulnerable in a new country for the first time, looking for some kind of community and support.
Community, absolutely, yes. Yeah. And also you're absolutely right. The idea of I think at times even just financial comfortability. I think that's a big issue. If you only have to look, for example, even people trying to come over here, the belief is it's a Dick Whittington almost kind of legacy that the streets of London are paved with gold.
Sure.
So many people tend to believe that if you find your, and they do when they get here, we have a phrase in Sierra Leone when we say the overseas is level ground. Well, that more or less means that no matter your background, if you manage to get here, you should be able to improve your life. And people are willing to do anything, wash dishes or clean streets or work in nursing, absolutely anything to make money. So these girls, many of them, for example, who also don't have proper status to stay in the UK. The pastor's wife is also a human rights lawyer.
That's
So
right,
you can also help them with immigration cases. And the girls actually say this: if we stay close to these people, they can help us stay in this country. So they don't really see it as abuse. Okay, you're saying I should. And I think that the character of Kumba Machuri, she says that quite a lot. Says, no, no, no. I went to Sweden with this man and he gave me this watch which is worth 10 grand. So what do you mean abuse? I control myself. I have agency. I want to stay with these men. What is the alternative? Can I go back to Sierra Leone and basically struggle to afford rice and palm oil to eat? I'd much rather be here and have money. So there's always that and you're right, Ali, it's to do with exploitation. If you convince somebody, well, actually, I can significantly improve your life, they don't really see the abuse anymore. And that's quite sad.
So that's the corruption, but as you say, the other side of that is the friendship, particularly between the women in the book. Why did you want to write about that?
Yeah, I just thought, again, because like I said, because of the court, I just thought it was important because I think, I mean, I am no, you always have to be careful, I think, especially in these times. Even I was a bit apprehensive about writing about women. But I remember a couple of years ago going to Bloody Scotland, actually seeing Christopher Brookmeyer and his book with the Cliff House, which was more or less about a hen do. And I remember reading that, thinking this is a phenomenal book. I just thought, yeah, it's important just to see. I think by default, a lot of the time, men tend to be protagonists. Men tend to be featured much more heavily in literature. So I just thought it would be interesting to just look at women, especially if I was looking at religion and abuse. And like I said, because the core crime itself involved women, I just thought it would be good to more or less carry all the way. Even with the detective also, I thought, yeah, it was important that the main detective also has to be a female, Cynthia McEwen, and things like that. I just thought I'd run with that right through.
Yeah.
And have the men in the background, basically.
There are police involved, but it is driven by Hawa's kind of,
yeah.
You know, the police do come into it, but it's in no way a kind of procedural thing.
No, and that's quite interesting. I think, to be honest, Ali, and I'll hang my head in shame. It's part of it was just laziness because I thought, oh, police procedurally, that means you have to do a bit more research because you have to. I'm working on a piece at the moment, actually. I'm just trying to, even though I set quite in the future, there's a lot much more police and procedure in it. I always just thought you need to know a bit about it. For reasons of authenticity, but I just thought if I don't have as much police in it, then I don't have to worry too much about their specific procedure. There's a bit, for example, where there's a press conference, and I remember watching one on the BBC, which was like a press conference for a missing person, and I almost transcribed it word for word, just trying to listen to the language they use and more or less what are the different scenarios. Or Ali Braidwood has disappeared. Could it be this or that scenario? This, and I found that to be very, very fascinating. Just watching what they do and the language they use, and I try to put that into the book, but nothing too deep at all. Nothing too deep at all.
I was wondering, once readers start to talk to you about the book, do you learn anything new about it? Are you surprised by kind of reactions? People might say, "Oh, I think you were clearly meaning to do that," and you think, "No, I wasn't." I mean, what's the situation when you start to get into discussions about your own writing?
Yeah, you absolutely. I think one of the ones we've already mentioned, the one about Anaka hats being like a proxy. I think the thinking for many readers is that I put it there deliberately as a device for people for things to be explained to her, and that was never the intention at all. But when you look back, you actually think, well, actually, yeah, that holds water. That's quite true. So yeah, definitely that also, and of course, the religious aspect also has got lots of, I mean, acclaim in the sense many people actually saying, especially from Sierra Leone, saying, actually, yeah, that's quite true. I went to my old head of department. She has a book club, and she invited me, and it was fascinating listening to them speak. They also spoke more or less about, they were very fascinated with the bonds of community, how people basically operate. I suppose when you're far away from home, Ali, the tendency is you try to more or less gravitate towards each other. But they're fascinated about this community within a community. I think that's also quite interesting. I think, yeah, because at times you just write it. And even when he won the competition, when I went down to London, a lot of the judges made that point that I think there's a scene earlier on when she's trying to find where Othella has gone to, and she goes to Bear's Den to visit a friend who's having a party. And I just wrote the way more or less we have parties. Our parties are normally all the same. If it's a birthday party for you or christening for my child, it's the same format. Everybody turns up, everybody brings food, and we just dance to music. So that's more or less what I did, and that's more or less what I described. And the judges more or less said they found that to be quite interesting, an interesting insight. So I think the cultural aspect, it was, and it was fun. That even though we are very much in Scotland, but the way we operate, we have this tendency to also just do things that we would normally do in Africa.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly.
And as someone who knows Bear's Den a bit, it's quite interesting to have that kind of juxtaposition.
Yeah, because I trained there. Yeah, exactly. My teacher training, when I was trained to become a teacher, I'm sure you know, there used to be St. Andrews College up there. And I used to travel, I was a bit broke by then, I'll get the bus from Edinburgh and train station. You get the Mulgai train, you know the Mulgai train, yes, exactly, and get and walk up. And Bears Den used to fascinate. It used to look so nice and very, very important. Oh, if somebody's a bit affluent and if this girl's might quite a rich husband, Bears Den is a good place for her to live. So I just chose Bears Den.
Yeah, no, it's the perfect setting for that couple, definitely. Yeah. And the book has had, as we've mentioned, award-winning and a wonderful reception. How do you reflect on that now? That must be really heartwarming to people.
Yeah, it's humbling because it's a long journey. Like I said, I did my writing degree way back in 2015, so that's almost a decade ago. And I remember, you were there with me when the young lady asked us about more or less about getting published, and we gave her advice, Mariam and Callum and I. And it is at times you have no idea where these, when you set out to write, it's more or less comes from a place of passion. You have no idea where these things are going to go.
Yeah.
And like I said, I never thought I was a crime writer. All what I did was literally fictionally civil war and corruption and things like that. It just so happened that there was a call for this and I responded and then it took off. So it's quite humbling to see. I was, for example, at the Edinburgh Festival and that just blew me away. I'm thinking, oh dear Lord, I would never have thought that a book like this would go to a place like that. So, the very far I'm talking to you, that's been the people I've met. People like yourself, Ali, all the other writers and agents, and you go to these places and this whole community. The very first time I met Callum, he opened his bag and took out a copy of the book. That almost just floored me. I said, "Oh my God, you've read my book!" Callum Scully, he's just a delightful human being. It's just so lovely. So yeah. It's just been humbling, the whole experience.
Yeah, and I think perhaps why a festival like Edinburgh would take note of your book is because you're writing about something that perhaps hasn't been written about in Scotland.
I agree, possibly, yeah.
Community in Scotland before,
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think it's supposed, because it is set in Edinburgh and it is about a community. It is a bit different, absolutely.
Talking about your writing courses, you obviously think it's a good thing for writers to kind of consider doing. Some people. There's more now, I think, than there's ever been in terms of the courses.
Yeah.
And some are, I think, did you do it part-time or?
Yeah, I did it because it was distance. I did it full-time. So yeah, it was an interesting. I just thought I just had the itch to more or less do a postgrad in writing. So I did it. I applied again. That's another thing. I applied at the University of Glasgow. I did not get in. I wasn't accepted. So I tell that story when you talk about rejection. I suppose that's a form of rejection if you cannot even get into writing school. And the reference letter was written by my head teacher of our school at the time, and I remember him saying, "Oh, of course you get in, of course," but I didn't get in. So I then, of course, applied to Falmouth, who accepted me, and it was online. You just read online, and you meet quite a close collection of other people who are writing it. So yeah, it was. You finish, and then you just start to send out pieces, short stories, and just you query here, you query there, and just see where it takes you. But it was an interesting journey. But I had no massive expectations. I had no chip on my shoulder. I just say whatever happens, happens, and it just so happens.
And in terms of the process, the kind of journey, if you like, to getting published, has anything surprised you about that?
It's grim. You hear that all the time. It's not easy in the sense that I think the industry is an interesting industry, to say the least, in terms of what gets published. and what they want to get published. I remember even at Bloody Scotland, I sat down with a writer who from down south, and I remember her saying to me, "Oh, if you want to sell more books, you should set it in America." So you get, and I'm thinking, but I don't know America. Why would I want to sell? So it's fascinating how you get all these other pieces of advice, what you have to do, and that applies to even trying to get published. Like the amount of things you send out. Oh, this doesn't engage me. It has to be immediate. So you think, okay, does that mean I have to have something very, very explosive happen on the very, very first page? So all these different agents you send out always, yeah, I didn't like it. The pace is too slow. You need to improve your pace. It drags a bit. I don't understand. So it's a case of you're trying to hit all of these different targets if you want to get published. And then, of course, somebody pick this up, and then I suppose you have a bit more leeway to do what you want to do. But I think you have to jump through a few hoops, and it's not easy, but that's just the way it is.
That just makes me think of Ian Banks' novel The Crow Road, which the
Crow Road, oh yes.
It was the day my grandmother
exploded. Absolutely. There you go. Exactly.
Got them right from the start.
You're right in there. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Famous opening line. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned Bloody Scotland there, and you were involved, but it's been a big part of your career.
Oh, yeah, actively so. Because like I said, I was there in 2022 with Claire. I mean, Claire Wilson was also there. We were part of the Pitch Perfect cohort for that year. Both of us didn't win, but we both pitched a novel. And it's fascinating to see, I mean, 3 years later, the journeys we've taken. That she's got published and I've also got published. And I suppose that's, and I think Natalie was the year after us. She also,
that's right.
Absolutely. So, and that's more, it is, I don't think there are many things like it, Ali, the fact that you literally stand up and speak. And I think I mentioned that on Instagram recently. I think that's quite a unique avenue to sell a novel, because words on a paper, I think, can be a bit, how can you say, more or less you write them and you send them off. It's almost as if they're going into a vacuum. But I like the point that you physically stand up and articulate what your novel is about. And I think that's something quite nice about that, actually.
I would say if you are a writer and you're not sure what to do next, you've maybe written something or you've got an idea or anything, more than any festival I can think of, Bloody Scotland would be the place to go, where you do get
shadow of a doubt. Yeah, I mean, just being in that space for those 2-3 days, it just blows you away. It's just, I don't think I've been to a few others, but yeah, it's fascinating. I've always had a soft spot for Stirling. I did study there back in the days. I like Stirling, but you're right, Bloody Scotland is just. Even the event we did at the end, I was just thinking, this is just brilliant. It's just such a lovely, lovely, lovely space. It really is quite good.
Yeah, because you spoke about the crime writing community being inclusive and welcoming one, and it really does. I mean, it's almost become a stereotype, partly because I've said it much, but it is.
Totally, yes.
And you mentioned that you're working on something just now. Is it a next novel?
Yeah, I mean, it's possibly maybe the novel before that came before Othella Savage. It was like completely, it was as part of your degree, you have to, of course, write the opening to a novel. It's like the equivalent of your dissertation. And it was more or less to do with, I think I've mentioned this before, child soldiers, where I grew up. I remember being friends with a couple of guys who were like orphans, and we had these orphanage SOS children's villages, Ali, but the circumstances in these villages were very, very luxurious, very, very affluent. And especially in a society of poverty, many, many kids started to more or less like lie to be able to gain access to, out of desperation. I'm a street kid, I don't have anything, then I can invent some kind of trauma that gets me admitted to these centers. So I just took that context and tried to move it towards the war. At the close of the war, of course, there was all these rehabilitation centers for child soldiers. And then we have a child soldier who's not a child soldier, but wants to gain access to this place. And I just thought, so I wrote something along those lines. And he's friends with a school teacher. And it's more or less how their lives intertwine. But nobody picked it up. So, but it's there now. So that's a possibility. And I've also thought about being a dance dad. There's also something there tied to crime, but I'll see how that goes. But I one or two things just on bubbling away.
Because Othella Savage has been so well received, do you feel any pressure to follow it up, or you're just going to say, no, I'm a writer and I've been a writer for a long time and I'm just going to write what I want to?
Or what you mean by follow? Do you mean like a sequel to it, or to write crime?
Well, not necessarily a sequel. Yeah, I guess to write crime or to write something in the similar vein.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. I have been thinking of one or two things. I mean, I recently saw something about, I think, what ICE agents in America arrested one of our military leaders who's been living in America at least since the 90s. And I clearly remember him when the military took over in our country. He was quite a controversial figure. And I remember him being in Sierra Leone. And one of the big controversies was the fact he imported a dog from London and he drove the dog in the car, and that was more or less headline news. So it was a very charismatic figure, but he was also the Minister of Sports. He was a military soldier put in charge of sports. And there was also rumors that he trained with the national football team. Okay. And there's always rumors that he intended to play for the national team. So I always remember when I saw his arrest in America, I'm thinking that's quite a charismatic character there. There's something I can do with him. He's been in America all this time. What if we examine what his life has been like? There's something there. But is it just like the genesis of an idea? Nothing too major at the moment.
And as we're talking, we're both sitting in front of bookshelves. I was thinking, do you feel you need to be a big reader to be a writer?
I think so. I think I'm sure I think it occurs naturally. We say it to the kids all the time.
Yeah.
There's always that, even just getting them to the big conversation at the moment. I'm sure you know this, Ali, in schools. I've been in schools for quite a while. Is the significant drop in the literacy rate of pupils, more or less due to these devices, phones and things like that. They don't read anymore. And the amount of times, by the time they get like to S5, S6, and the parents come to parents saying, "Oh, how do I get them to improve?" And of course, you don't want to tell them that it's too late.
Yeah.
You need to have a reading habit, especially if you want to write. That's the best way to do. And I always tell the kids, there's this mindset that when we say read, it has to be a big book. I said, no, it can even be non-fiction. Read a newspaper. If you, for example, go to The Guardian, I always say The Guardian because it's free, but it has sections, Ali. So there's no requirement that you have to read politics, read sports, read entertainment, read culture, read cinema, read a movie review, watch a football match, read a match review. Because it's in a quality newspaper, the quality of writing is going to be of a certain level. And the same thing applies to reading. If you want to become a writer, and I'm sure, I mean, looking at your bookcase, there's always, as I'm talking to you, I just had a book drop through the letterbox. I'm always buying things. You're constantly buying things. You're always buying things. And I spend more, but I love it. I just absolutely love it. I like buying books. It's good.
When you were talking earlier on about the Hardy Boys and Nancy,
yeah,
I loved all those.
Oh, they were brilliant, Ali. Oh my God, they were so good. I mean, these young boys who solve crimes with their father, who's a detective. Yeah, it was very good. Yes, and Frank and Joe. That was their names. Yes, exactly. The Hardy Boys. It was just brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
And so before we leave you, do you have any recommendations for our listeners? A book that you think, oh yeah, you would like this?
At the moment, Layla Motley, I think I've got it here. I'll bring it down. The Girls Who Grew Big. I think this is a good one. So just bring it. Sorry, Ali.
It's okay.
Oh, sorry, dropping the. Yeah, this is actually quite a good book.
Oh,
yeah.
Lola Motley, The Girls
Who Grew Big.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, I think it's to do, she writes very well. I think she was shortlisted for the book a while ago. It's to do with girls. I think it ties quite nicely to themes in Othella Savage. It's more or less when you think about the treatment of women. It's more or less, I think, girls who got pregnant, and of course their pregnancies were seen like a sign of shame, and so they had to be sent away. It's similar, for example, I remember watching a movie, I think it's the Magdalene Girls.
Yeah.
Exactly, that kind of thing when, if you're a girl, for example, out of wedlock, it's like a sign of shame back in the day. You cannot get pregnant, ergo, you are contaminated, you're violent, then you have to be sent away. So, yeah, that would be my recommendation. She's a phenomenal writer. That would be definitely my recommendation. And The Poor Christ of Bomber, of course, which I mentioned earlier on.
Yeah.
Good.
Fantastic.
Definitely.
Two great recommendations. Foday, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for taking the time to do so today.
Thank you so much for having me, Alias. It's always a pleasure. I'm humbled and honored. Thank you immensely, and have a lovely weekend.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.